Welcome back to another episode of Foolproof Theology. My name is Chase Davis, and I am your host. It's great to be with you here today. We're going to talk with Auron MacIntyre about his book, Total State, The Total State. Auron, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Yeah, thanks again for having me.
Absolutely. It's great to have you again. We talked about conquest laws, which is one of my favorite episodes. I think it was actually one of the most popular we've had. If you're a listener and you haven't listened to that, you can go find that back in the catalog there. But it comes up in the book. So if that kind of was a teaser there for that episode, you can go buy Auron's book and we'll talk about where you can get that. But you wrote this book, Total State, and at the beginning, you kind of share some of your story, Auron, about being a journalist. And kind of off air, we were talking about journalists and kind of the methods and their tactics. But I mean, you kind of talk about how you were in that industry. You were a journalist at a local newspaper. So how did that kind of shape your understanding of politics and your approach and how you wrote Total State?
Yeah, I think like a lot of people who probably have heard this, I grew up as a talk radio conservative, a very mainstream, normal GOP type voter. And I went to college for politics. I worked a little bit in Republican politics when I first came out of college. But, I have the story that all of us have when it comes to how politics is supposed to work. And then I weirdly fell backwards. I didn't go to journalism school. It was just a thing where a friend of a friend had me do some things, and I started doing some freelance work. And then inevitably, I ended up becoming a senior writer at a local paper. And what I saw there was kind of behind the scenes. I got to see how the sausage got made, especially when it came to Donald Trump. I was, again, a local reporter. But when we had intersections with that story, when Trump would come to town or he would do something in the national news, would have that kind of reach into localities, I could see the way that things played out. And as we got closer and closer to 2020, I started to feel the heat, right? I started to feel kind of the level of manipulation and the level of animus from the press towards a guy who I had never had really strong feelings about one way or another. All of a sudden it became very clear, like it was the mission of every one of these guys. Nobody had sent out like a memo. Like I was working in a newsroom. I didn't like get something in my inbox that said, "We hate Trump now, destroy him." But it was very clear that there was this kind of miasma of like, well, we have to get rid of him by any means possible. Anything we say to get rid of him is worth it. And then obviously 2020 hit and I watched everything happen. I watched churches get shut down. I watched people go to jail for trying to play in parks. I watched these riots break out, even though we've just been told that we had to like end the worship of God because, the First Amendment had to be thrown in the trash because we were all going to die. And then like these people could just run through the streets and burn things down and nobody cared. And I was like, okay, so politics doesn't work anyway. Like it doesn't work at all the way I was taught. Like the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, all these things that as a conservative, listening to Rush Limbaugh and all this stuff, I believe this was as fundamental. It is right below, like the divinity of Christ is like to my worldview. Like this was core, right? And I just watched it all be destroyed. And all the conservatives and libertarians who'd spent their whole lives telling me like, no, we will be saved. When tyranny comes, the restrictions on government, the separation of powers, the freedom of the press, all these things will stop what happened. And none of it did. And I was like, okay, well, if this isn't how politics works, how does it actually work? And so the story of the Total State is really the book is about my intellectual journey as I kind of try to figure out, okay, how does power really work? What really happens here? How are these politics really playing out? And is there a way to fix this? Given that the system that I learned about as someone who was on the right simply doesn't seem to exist.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think, for listeners that are familiar with my podcast, I had a similar journey in 2020 where, and this is just not you and I, there's a lot of people kind of waking up to the way things actually are. And being a pastor, being in a church, it was very disturbing. I mean, we are about the worship of God, the living God. And so watching these leaders like Jonathan Lehman or David Platt or these other people who are willing to close down their churches kind of indefinitely and then go out and march in these rallies, these riots, whatever they were, it was just very disturbing. I think one of the things that was hard back then was figuring out, okay, if what I have believed may not be the entire truth or may even be a lie, you see some people unfortunately veer into like total deconstruction or or kind of like going kind of BAP on people and just that method. What were some handholds that you found, either that you had already on your shelf or people you'd already listened to? Who are thinkers you were paying attention to in 2020 that kind of helped you go, okay, this is helping me make more sense of the world and how it works?
I had been watching for a while this political commentator called Dave the Distributist, Dave Greeny, and he had talked about this thinker called Curtis Yarvin. And Curtis Yarvin had a couple of ideas about the way that the media worked and the way that power worked. And I hadn't paid a lot of attention because I was more interested in kind of his cultural his videos on religion and kind of community and these things. But the more 2020 unfurled, the more I started paying attention to the power and the politics stuff. And once I read Curtis Yarvin, Yarvin draws very heavily from a school of political theory called Italian elite theory or political realism, from kind of the line of Machiavelli. And there's people like James Burnham and Vilfredo Pareto and Gaetano Mosca, names that outside of maybe James Burnham, most people probably have not heard. They're not familiar with a lot of these thinkers. But James Burnham was actually a core part of like the National Review, along with many of the key thinkers in the conservative movement. So his thought is not completely alien to the right, but it's something that we simply don't talk about a lot anymore. And by going down that kind of rabbit hole of those thinkers and expanding even further to other thinkers like Bertrand de Juvenal and Joseph de Maistre, I found that there's actually a long lineage of conservative or right-wing thinkers who had addressed these problems and this understanding of power that was just absent from contemporary right-wing thought. And so I found them very helpful as I tried to tackle this problem of what was going on in the contemporary world.
Yeah, and I think that's really helpful because you can actually see that there's a deep well to pull from, not just from Christian history, but also just political theory. I was watching people like Tim Pool for a while and kind of watching his evolution on a lot of different matters. And then I was watching Sargon of Akkad. I don't know if you've ever heard of that guy, but I'd be up at 11 p.m. Watching YouTube, and I'm like, who is this guy saying these uncouth things that you're not allowed to say out loud? And so I was already kind of primed to explore this stuff. But that's been one of the great joys over the last few years, is discovering the history, the tradition, and I appreciate that in your book Total State, you really do pull from that tradition a lot. You're citing a lot of important thinkers. Tell me something just right off the bat, and we'll get into this. You kind of highlight up front in the book that there's a common fallacy, and you've already kind of talked about it. This kind of this idea of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and this will save us, and all this kind of stuff. And you highlight later in the book one of the quotes that I like to use, albeit subversively, from John Adams, that the Constitution was only meant for a virtuous people. And we have to get to the question, okay, so what do we do if we don't have a virtuous populace anymore? But the question I want to prime the conversation with is, what is the story that is not true about our political arrangement?
So one of the things that I think a lot of people bank on is the idea of the Enlightenment, and that the American Constitution is a creature of the Enlightenment. And during the Enlightenment, we went from this state of being kind of very primitive, mystical, superstitious people, and we became hyper rational. And even as Christians, we often believe this. Like, even though that kind of goes against our own understanding of human nature, we buy into this idea of human progress, this idea that we have fundamentally changed human nature and evolved human nature into a state where we don't need to operate in this old primitive way when it comes to power or narratives or kind of belief. And so what we like to think is that the Constitution is kind of this advanced piece of political technology that was engineered by the brightest minds with, kind of, who had come out with the cutting edge, kind of technology when it came to how the state should be ordered. And the way that the Constitution is set up is so perfect. It's this machine that is well oiled, that runs itself. Like, each one of those pieces, the power is set about against power, like Madison says in Federalist 51, and all the checks and balances and the divisions of powers, everything are so perfectly set up that we're not really subject to other people. We're no longer governed by men. You'll hear this all the time. It's not a government of men, it's a government of laws, right? And what they mean by that is we're governed by a system. and the system is sovereign. We're not under a king. We're not under, the whims of some crazy tyrant. We've got a system that kind of runs everything. And what you see, especially when we look at the events of something like 2020, is that actually all of these systems are still operated by people. That actually we didn't get rid of the problem of politics, because the problem of politics is people. And as Christians, we know that people are not perfectible, that we live in a fallen world, and we live in a scenario where we cannot make the world we are currently in uh, better, or we can make it better, but we cannot make it perfect. Like only God can actually change the hearts in that way. And so we had this kind of understanding that we had abandoned all these systems, but the Constitution ultimately is only an instantiation of our traditions, our folkways, our way of being, our understanding. And so when the people of the United States created the Constitution in 1790, it was not setting up a perfect system that would run on its own in perpetuity. It was simply inculcating and formalizing the way they were already running their country, the way they were already operating as a people, because they were very virtuous, because they had all of these ways of being, all these traditions that bound them together and restricted their behavior. They were able to exercise a large degree of what we would call self-governance. But ultimately, the Constitution only works because we are continually renewing and applying that. And as you said, if we lose that, if we simply think that the Constitution is going to just go do its own thing and protect us, then ultimately we end up being ruled by people who are manipulating the systems we think we're ruled by.
Yeah, absolutely. And I put a few quotes in the notes that I have here that really stood out to me that highlight this well. You say, "We are taught that this is what holds the ruling class accountable, that they must listen to and obey the will of the people or lose the power they so deeply covet. Yet this is not how the relationship really works. There's a reason the incumbency rate for members of Congress reliably hovers around 90%, while Congress's popularity remains mired in the single digits. If the will of the people is the key to legitimating the power of the ruling class, then the ruling class must take an interest in controlling the will of the people. The good news for our elite is that mass media provides the perfect tool for doing this." And I remember seeing this with some clips people did, and you highlight like Harvard, Yale, New York Times, and everyone kind of acknowledges these are powerful institutions. But I'm even thinking like local news stories, and you have these kind of these clips all mashed together of them saying the exact same thing in different states and different cities. I noticed this locally with 9 News here in Denver, which is the most popular news channel, with how they talked about every issue. It was always, and I foolishly tried to like write emails to 9 News and was like, "Hey, there's different perspectives," and of course I never heard anything. But on issues like transgenderism or COVID or whatever it was always a narrative shaping. And so I want to talk a little bit about this concept, and maybe we need to talk about that first. But I want to hear about the cathedral. This is a concept from Yarvin, I believe, but I think it plays into the cathedral because one of the most powerful ways that the elites, the kind of bureaucrats can shape the will of the people, control the consent of the governed, is to control how they perceive the world, how they view things. And it can be very difficult to talk to people who are so trapped in that mindset, who have been just kind of like sucking on the teat of news media and have no other frame of reference. Does this play into the cathedral at all?
Yeah, absolutely. This is actually the core of the cathedral, as you kind of identified there. So, like you said, the one of the big shifts that happens in kind of the post-Enlightenment era, when this is many people tie this directly to the founding of the United States, is the death of the monarch, right? The shift from monarchies to democratic republics. And the idea here is that the popular sovereignty is the legitimating mechanism. And so what we tend to think is that what happened is we shift the power to the people, right? They become the legitimating mechanism. They're the ones that the popular sovereignty, right? And they grant that to the leader. They hand that to the leader. And so what we think is that restrains the government. That democratic impulse restrains the government. Actually, if you look at what has happened, governments have only grown. In fact, they've exploded and expanded. The power of the state has become exponentially larger under democracies. And you have to ask, well, how does that happen, right? If democracy is supposed to limit the size of government, limit the power of government, but governments keep getting larger and keep getting more power, then what's happening there? And the way that happens is that we didn't lose a ruling class. We tend to think that because we no longer have a coronation and a king and like a noble family, that the ruling class is gone. But that's not real. Like in the real life, in real countries, you always have a ruling class. Even in a representative democracy, the idea is you hand power over to a small set of people and then they make the decisions. Yeah, in theory, you choose them, but they're the ones who ultimately wield power. And what they quickly understand is if you want to stay in power, then the best thing to do is to manipulate the system to make sure that you are always chosen by the democratic system. As you pointed out, the numbers for Congress there, right? Generally, Congress is very unpopular, but they keep staying in power. That ruling class solidifies, even though they've got this 90% disapproval rate. How does that happen? Well, everybody likes their congressman. And the reason they like that is because there's a manipulation of the way that you understand what happens. So the idea of the cathedral is that the way that our regime manufactures consent is that they have control of many different nodes inside our country. So it's the media, it's the educational system, it's the non-elected bureaucracy of the United States. A lot of people call the deep state, but it also goes to corporations and many other aspects. And a lot of people think of this as like some kind of evil conspiracy theory, right? Like a cabal. But that's not it. That's not actually what's happening there. There isn't some central office where they're typing out those those messages that you're talking about. But that does happen because of the AP. Actually, the AP wire writes the news for most of the country, and most people don't realize that. And that's just one of the many nodes in the cathedral. And what happens is these guys share basically a moral vision for the world. They share a religion, and that religion is progressive liberalism. They all go to the same colleges. They all, if you want to be part of the ruling elite, you need to go to these elite universities. You want to get a job at the New York Times, you want to get a job at the Pentagon, you want to get a job running something inside one of the federal departments, you want to get a job doing any of this stuff, you still have to go all of the same places, right? They all go to the same small subset of universities, and they all share the same culture. They marry each other, they have the same friends, and so they have the same worldview. And so even though there's no specific written down, here's what we're doing today, here's the world domination agenda coming out, they all end up operating and moving towards the same goals. And each one of these organizations basically does what any good religion does, which is provide a kind of peer pressure, right? If the New York Times sees that someone in the Department of Defense isn't being loyal enough to progressivism, they go and write a story attacking them. If somebody in the education system sees that there isn't enough of this idea being pushed out, they encourage there to be more of that inside of the university system or the public schools, this kind of thing. And so in this way, even though there's not an explicit, hey, here's exactly what the ruling class is doing and everyone needs to say exactly this word at this time, what we end up getting is this effect of changing people's minds and manipulating them in every interaction. Everything you read, everything you see, all of the classes you go to, everyone you talk to, all has the same opinion because it's all filtering down from this consensus-making apparatus that is more of a distributed, decentralized network rather than like one monolithic, like Politburo or something that we would have in the Soviet Union, but ends up doing the same job, which is regulating the thought patterns of the people who then go out and vote and provide that popular sovereignty.
Yeah, and I've even seen this in Christians. I think many Christians are kind of aloof on these matters because they've bought into, like you referenced, this Enlightenment ideal of rationalism. And so even when I'm talking to people about books they're reading, like I remember talking to one Christian brother about The Color of Compromise by Jamar Tisby, and I was like, hey, I want to send you a few reviews from some trusted scholars before you get into it, just so you can kind of know what you're getting into. He's like, no, I don't need outside sources informing my opinion. I can make conclusions on my own. And I'm like, that's it. Like that's the tension. That's the rub, is that these books and these publications, they're governed by a set of assumptions. And most Christians live naively thinking they can just kind of digest all this information and come out with rational conclusions that are good, true, and beautiful. And I don't think that's the way humankind is designed by God. I think we are invariably shaped by social conditions, peer pressure, families, social networks, and the information we receive. So I think it's important to really point this out for Christians, particularly to be paying attention. Not that, because I think one of the misconceptions is that it depends on what echo chamber, they call it an echo chamber, you get into. And so if you are only consuming certain news media, then you're going to be shaped by those opinions, which of course that has truth to it.
Mhm.
And so like back in the day, I would try to listen to NPR to get like a balanced, I'd do like NPR. I probably wouldn't listen to Fox News because Fox News always annoyed me, but I try to like get a conservative, get a liberal viewpoint and try to make my own conclusion. But once I understood this concept that you're talking about in the book, I just became really like befuddled and frustrated. I was like, why am I doing this? It seems like a losing battle and it seems pointless. I want to pull one thread that you kind of talked about there with the AP. There's this kind of concept in a lot of Christian circles, especially the evangelical elite, where if there's just kind of enough faithful witness, if let's imagine you could get to the top of the AP as a Christian, and then you could control, you could help shape the narrative. And you see this with people like David French going to the New York Times. Back in 20 years ago, that was kind of like an aspirational goal for many of the evangelical elite. Do you feel like this is a useful strategy or kind of a losing strategy? What do you make of that?
Usually people call this entryism. And the problem with entryism is this: people look at the left, right? They look at like the long march of the institution, and they say, well, if the left can take over the institution, then I can take over the institution, right? Like I just go in and I climb to the top and then I set the agenda. And now, the Leviathan is in my control and I'm the one who can wield this thing. And I like the impulse of being like, I should go in and learn how to like acquire power. That's reasonable. Like that's at least a understanding of like there is power, it is real, it's going to be used, and so it should be used to advance a good worldview and a positive thing and something I believe in, rather than just abandoning it to my enemies. So I want to be clear: what I'm about to say is not an argument for like complete pacifism in interacting with the culture, institutions, or anything like that at all. That's not what I'm saying. But the problem with entryism is this: the left was able to enter in and dismantle the ideology of our institutions because that is how the left works. I talk about this in the book. We talked about this in Conquest Laws, right? On previous episode, of the nature of these organizations and the nature of the left and the dialectic allows them to unwind the standards, the core tenets of the organization for power. And that's what allows them to enter in a new organization that they fundamentally disagree with and turn it towards their ends. As conservatives or people on the right, we don't have that option because we operate in a fundamentally different way. The right draws its power from truth, from standing on core truths, not from dismantling. So we don't have the option of walking into an organization built on core truths and saying, well, we're going to slowly wear your truths away and replace them with our own. That's not how it works. We found things, we stand on that truth, and we protect it. And that's what actually creates the strength of the right. And so while I like the impulse of saying, I'm going to get in there and I want to replace this thing with my thing, ultimately what you really need is a parallel institution that is founded on truth and is founded and protected inside your worldview that outcompetes out and then replaces something like the AP, rather than going in and saying, I'm going to turn the AP to my, because eventually the AP doesn't becomes this super based organization. You become David French.
Yeah, right. And I've learned this lesson the hard way with some of my ecclesial affiliations. But yeah, it can be very hard, and it can almost be depressing because you're like, so I have to start a new institution. Man, like that's a lot of work. But there's a lot of good people out there trying to do this that I appreciate. American Reformer would be a good example of that. But there's many other institutions that are starting up by good thinkers today. One of the things that comes up is the topic of individual liberty. And I've talked about this on the podcast before, but you talk about it in the book, and so I want to highlight it and how this concept of individual liberty. You kind of think of the Gadsden flag, I think it's called, where it's like, "Don't tread on me," and so I want you to kind of share with the listener what is it about individual liberty that most people misunderstand? Like, what are the liabilities of individual liberty?
Well, a lot of times, especially in the United States, we just like say we fight for freedom and liberty, right? And we use those words interchangeably, and we think of them in this very libertine sense, this very libertarian sense of, you should be able to do whatever you want. The government shouldn't be involved. No one should be able to impose their opinion upon you. And that's really like the end goal. Like that's the job. That's what the Constitution's there to do. That's the only reason to be involved in politics at all, is to basically pull apart constraints and liberate ourselves entirely. Now, as Christians and people on the right, we should be very wary of this, because actually many of the restrictions that are placed on us are natural and good, and they're there for a reason. In fact, that's a critical part of a healthy life, is understanding those. And if we look at what the founding fathers, or most of what the founding fathers actually believed about liberty, it's very different from our current conception of liberty. And it's certainly radically, our conception is very radically different from what the ancients believed about liberty. So, many of the ancients would have said, you need liberty, you need a state that has liberty. But that didn't mean that the state didn't have laws or didn't put restrictions, or that there wasn't a large amount of kind of societal expectation on the individual. What it meant was you had a liberty to pursue virtue. It meant that the state was not working to stop you from pursuing the things that are good and beautiful and true, the things that are naturally ordered and following after what we would believe, of course, would be God's will. And so the idea is not that the state should have no power or ever make a restriction or put any kind of limiter on your expectations of freedom, but rather that liberty comes from being bound in a community, from understanding your role and your place in it, and being able to choose to act in a way that will put you into right relationship with God and your fellow man. And because we've lost that, we've really lost the important things that actually hold government accountable. So we think that what holds government accountable is like written laws somewhere. But as we already spoke of with the Constitution, that's not the case. The only thing that ever checks the power of government is actually our commitment to each other. The fact that other social spheres, the church, the family, the community, the tribe, our merchant guilds, even, these things are things that act against the power of the state. And when the state has to compete with all of these other kind of interlocking spheres of authority, then its power is naturally limited. And that's what actually creates liberty. That's what actually controls the power of the state. But when we eat away at those things, when we dissolve the family, we dissolve the church, we dissolve the community, inevitably the power of the state will rush in and fill that. And that's what creates tyranny. Tyranny is not a function of just having an evil king. Tyranny is a function of what happens when the rest of society erodes and government is the only thing trying to hold it together. And so when we think of individual liberty, we're thinking of something that actually reduces ultimately what actually creates liberty, which is those interlocking circles of spheres of control, of social influence that actually limit government.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So with individual liberty, I have a lot of friends that are into libertarianism. And when I try to have conversations about political theory, political thought, uh, systems of government, all this kind of stuff, they become very unnerved. They're very libertarian, just live and let live. Why is libertarianism itself insufficient to fight against this kind of tyrannical total state?
So the problem with libertarians, and there are some base libertarians out there, guys from the Mises Caucus, guys who are familiar with Hans Hermann Hoppe, they do, there's some good stuff out there. But ultimately, the core problem I run into with most libertarians is twofold. One, they first, they think that the state is like some weird artificial thing, when actually the state is as almost as natural as the family. It's one of the oldest institutions in human social organization. And so they don't like this. They get angry at me when I say this, but they are just Marxists. And by that, I don't mean they actually follow like the ideas of Marx, but in the same way that communists want to ignore realities about human beings and human organization to like shape humanity to the will, the libertarian also wants to ignore basic truths about humans, that we are social animals, that we do create societies, and that those societies are ultimately governed by something that would be called a state. almost all libertarianism is just rearrangement. It's a ball game about like what you're going to do with the actual state. Well, we'll privatize it. Well, what does that mean? Well, we give all the guns to guys that we hire, and then they like, what do? Well, they act basically like a government. Okay, so you created the state in another way. The other problem with libertarians is they invert the order of order. So what happens is, to create a state of order and to create liberty, what happens is you go from like war and chaos to kind of martial control to rule by law and then liberty, right? Like you have to inculcate virtue and order to get to liberty. For libertarians, they think you create liberty and then virtue and order follows, right? I have liberty and now I'm free to live in virtue and order. But again, that misunderstands the human condition. People are not virtuous naturally. They do not naturally do these things. And so you need order to lead to liberty. Liberty does not create order. And I think those are the two main things that keep libertarians, because ultimately they have to ignore power. And when you ignore power, you ignore a critical part of human existence, and therefore you're doing utopian thinking in the same way that a communist would ultimately.
Yeah, this brings up an interesting topic, and we're kind of deviating a little bit from the notes, but I think it's pertinent to the book. Is the issue of power and the way Christians think about power. We've been so inundated with messaging about, and they're taking Bible verses, so you're they're twisting them, but we talk about laying down your life for others, and Christ, and kind of the concept in Philippians where he gave up his power, and so Christians should do the same thing. And you see this all the time. I mean, I hear this from evangelical elite all the time. We should give up power. And if you were to suggest, either from the pulpit or just in a Bible study, to Christians that we should pursue power is good, immediately they're going to be like, oh my gosh, that is awful. I can't believe you would say that. That's anathema. That's unbiblical. How would you speak to maybe a Christian audience that's been hearing this messaging for so long about either whether you want to call it the virtue of power, or why power is something that Christians should pursue? Like, how would you kind of help them come along on that topic?
So there's very strange things that happens with a lot of Christian leaders, and I've noticed the same thing. So if I was an atheist, right, and I'm coming up to you and I'm challenging your Christian faith, and I say, hey, the Bible says turn the other cheek, and I noticed you didn't let someone murder you, so you're violating Christ's teachings. Like, just as a Christian leader, what would you say to that? Like, what would be your response?
My response would be, look, you've misunderstood that particular passage, and you're not taking into account the whole Word of God and how it talks about the virtue of self-defense, because by that standard, you would make other people in the Bible in violation of God's law. So they've totally just butchered the Bible and misunderstood Jesus' teaching. This is talking about personal interactions with different brothers in the kingdom. This is talking about how we treat others. Like in church, it's not talking about, someone breaking into your home and self-defense, because if you were to take that to its logical conclusion, you would have to be a pacifist. And you see this all over the place. I mean, I was way into this radical named Shane Claiborne back in the day. And so you see this pacifistic instinct in different communities, but that's typically how I would try to be like, and personally, typically I would be like, well, you're not a Christian, so why should I listen to you about how Christians? You wouldn't do that to Muslims or Jews or anybody else. Why should I listen to you educate me on what Christianity means?
Yeah, but you're exactly right, and like that point is, and I would say the same thing. Christian leaders need to take the same approach when it comes to politics, right? They like. So the question, whenever in the same way where someone's like, oh, well, you can't have self-defense because Jesus said turn the other cheek. When it's like, oh, well, you have to give up power because Jesus gave up power. And the question is like, so do you think that the Bible says Christians have to commit civilizational suicide in the same way that an atheist thinks that turn the other cheek means you have to personally commit suicide to follow? And the answer is, of course, no, right? We had Christian countries since the beginning of Christianity. Since the dawn of Christianity, whether it's Ethiopia or Armenia, when it spreads to the Roman Empire, we had Christian countries. Countries were able to be Christian. Their leaders wielded power. They protected their citizens. They upheld Christian beliefs. It put them into their institutions. They fought defensive crusades against Muslim invaders to keep to keep Christendom intact. these are things that are part of Christian history. They align with Christian doctrine. And so the idea that Christians can't wield power or shouldn't wield power, well, if you're going to say that, then you need to go ahead and contradict basically the entirety of Christian civilization. And if you're one of these guys who says all of Christian civilization is bad, then okay, but you should probably just go be like a raging leftist atheist and stop pretending like you care about Christians. Like I just, it's one of these things that is obvious if you take 10 seconds, in the same way that I think the turn the other cheek thing is, if you take 10 seconds to put it in context and understand the wider history involved, then it makes perfect sense. But if you want to take like 2 passages out of the Bible and pretend like they exist all by themselves without any context and any historical, then okay, yeah, I guess you can create that fallacy, but it's just the fallacy of you should commit suicide as a society, and that doesn't seem helpful.
It does not seem helpful at all. And I think this is one of the unique opportunities that pastors have today, Christian leaders have today, is to talk about these issues, because it overlaps a lot into masculinity and the talk on masculinity. And a lot of men are taught, whether in the home or other places, that, to have power or authority or anything in the home, that's wrong. I've heard this, the only good thing you can do with your power is give it up. And it's like, man, like, no wonder a lot of the guys in either the manosphere or a lot of people will just accuse Christianity of being kind of a doormat religion, where it's like you just, give up and there's nothing to offer. And it's like, no, we as Christians have a lot to offer from the Bible, from Christian history. So I just think it's a very important topic. It'd be an interesting book to write, The Virtue of Power. I think it would cause a lot of people to die inside if they saw that. But it's really important to think about these things. Well, one of the things with power is, and I think it overlaps with the cathedral, is this concept of the managerial elite. And I've heard this concept talked about elsewhere. You talk about it in the book. So I want to hear from you. How do you describe the managerial elite, and why is it important for people to understand how the managerial elite function in our society?
Sure. So the cathedral is made up of the managerial elite. And the reason it's important to understand the managerial revolution is that it fundamentally changed the way that we order society. James Burnham, who again was a critical thinker and part of the conservative National Review for a long time, wrote a book called The Managerial Revolution. And in the Managerial Revolution, basically his thesis is that while we think about kind of the early 1930s, 1940s as this great war between Nazism and Soviet communism and liberal democracy. Ultimately, all of these states are the results of massification. The Industrial Revolution and mass communication create a very different way of being for people. They have to scale society up. It's now connected in a way that never was before. Society was far more contained and regional. Everything about your interactions was far more personal. And now everything has been turned into this massive bureaucracy, right? Everything is a giant corporation. Everything is a massive organization. Even churches now, right, are run this way. It's whether you're a general or you're a pastor or you're a CEO, everyone talks the same way, right? Everyone has the same skill set. They all seem to have the same kind of outlook. And the reason for that is the managerial revolution. We understood that in order to scale society up, you need a specific set of skills. You need to be able to operate bureaucracies in a particular way. And to be fair, massification came with incredible benefits, right? Like we can see the incredible material wealth that's created, the fact that we can, we've had big scientific advancements. We can ship products across the world at a moment's notice. We operate this huge just-in-time delivery system with massive efficiency that creates huge profits and all of these things, right? But what we don't think about is the fact that as we have created these institutions to serve our needs, these institutions have also molded us to serve their needs. And in many ways, you look at a church and the mega church is now like the American style because it can operate on a managerial framework, right? Everybody can scale up. And so the needs of the parishioners are not personal. They're all filtered through these programs. They're all put out on a spreadsheet. They're quantified. Everything is handled in the same way as you would handle a business. Everything is something that you can tweak for efficiency in every opportunity. And the problem is that allows manipulation of people. We are formed and changed and pressed into a specific mold so that we will work better inside that managerial framework. And so the particularities of humans and their cultures and traditions, and I guess the main thing is just that the managerial elite structure, the managerial structure, is the defining kind of structure of our government, because every one of our social institutions has to be this large bureaucracy. We have changed the way that we do everything, from consuming to producing to living our lives, our marriages, our worship. Everything we do has been conformed to this large bureaucratic structure, and the people who operate and manipulate those things are the ones who now rule us. And so that's why it feels like everything is impersonal and distributed. There's never any kind of authority. There's no specifics, because those things have all been distributed and spread out across these structures that are good for creating large amounts of efficiency, but ultimately fail at creating what humans need most, which is organic community and bonds.
Yeah, and it's fascinating when you think about the commodification of religion, particularly in evangelicalism. I was just at a mega church the other day, and if you go to one of these mega churches, and a lot of people do, obviously, and you can just get plugged into a system where it's very kind of cookie cutter, and there's a program for you, and you get put in a database. And I was tempted towards this when I first entered ministry. Spreadsheets and tracking people's discipleship progress and all that kind of stuff. But it really does. It's a bit dehumanizing. You're just kind of a cog in the machine, and maybe sometimes people need that, I guess, whether they're recovering from some pain or cynicism, and they just need to go to where they can hear a sermon and connect with other people. But it just plays right into kind of this individualism. It actually, under the guise of forming more communities, forming more connection, it just feeds into that kind of individual kind of attitude where you're not formed by deep commitments, deep bonds, kind of unchosen bonds with other people. And of course, this plays out with people being so mobile today, moving place to place for job to job, to go to college and all this kind of stuff. And so it can be very challenging, but I think it's something that churches need to resist in order to form people rightly in God's ways. Well, up until this point in the book, you're kind of feeling like, okay, this is really bad. This is not great. You're basically proposing we live in a tyranny. So you do get into the last few chapters and you talk about the total state's fall is inevitable. And so I wanted you to share kind of why is it inevitable that the total state will fall?
So the good or bad news, depending on how you feel about it, is that the current managerial structure is just unsustainable. As we were talking about, ultimately people need human connection. Ultimately, people are designed to share communities. They're designed to have those deep, intimate bonds. And something that's very scary for us, people who really like our individual liberty, we are designed to be dependent on each other and have people dependent on us. And this unnatural system where we have dissolved all of those bonds and handed over all of those responsibilities and dependencies to a system that is impersonal and gigantic and all these things is unhealthy. And we're seeing that now, right? We see how desperate people are for identity. People talk about identity politics and we need to worry about identity. What they don't understand is the reason that this is the current obsession is that people don't have healthy identity. They don't know who they are in their communities. They don't know who they are in their families. They don't know who they are in Christ. And because of that, they seek identity in unhealthy and artificial things. And this is just unsustainable. Yes, it's created all kinds of miraculous things. I won't pretend that these massive bureaucracies don't bring us cheap things, that they allow all kinds of material abundance and all kinds of massive organization that people would be very scared to live without. But ultimately, they are just unsustainable. We've seen this. We're seeing this now with things like the competency crisis, right? Where we're watching different systems fail because we simply cannot produce the caliber of person necessary to continue to operate these systems. We're noticing that the quality and reliability of these systems to deliver things, look at what happened with the pandemic. Look what happens when one of these canals gets locked up. All of a sudden, the system starts falling apart. We have kind of pushed efficiency to the edge And that miracle of efficiency, that miracle of production of material wealth and progress, ultimately is a false god. It's one that fails. And we have to go back to something more human and more organic. So the managerial elite are doomed because ultimately the system that they operate has limits, and their entire system is built on the idea that there are no limits.
Right.
And also it's built on the idea that you can turn humans into whatever you want. Humans are blank slates, they're tabula rasa. They can be changed into these just kind of soulless cogs that are interchangeable. But that's not how it works. And if you keep trying to force people into that, eventually the system breaks down because you stop producing just the basic level of emotional, spiritual, and intellectual competence necessary to have a real flourishing society.
Yeah, totally. And you see this, I keep bringing it back to churches because I'm a pastor, but like you see this in churches all the time where it's like, you'll get these Barna surveys or whatever that talk about basic biblical convictions about the resurrection of Jesus, the virgin birth, other things like this. And people are just woefully under discipled, biblically illiterate in many cases. And the megachurch, of course, is going to put more programs in place to help try. I mean, they will notice this and they will try, but ultimately if it's still approaching the formation in that same manner, the kind of a mega churchy McNugget church where it's just we can produce disciples at scale, it's actually not as fruitful as we've been led to believe. And that is one thing that gives me hope is while the system, the total state seems very powerful, and it is very powerful, it's kind of terrifying when you look at your book or just kind of look at the world and how it works. It's also very fragile, like you highlight. And it's fragile not only in its production, especially as they implement more DEI stuff in different industries,
Yeah.
most industries, and so it's incredibly fragile. There's kind of two strategies you highlight at the end: a conservative approach and the non-woke liberal approach to defeating the total state. What are those strategies, and why won't they work?
Sure. So right now, there are basically two strategies to opposing what's going on, this constant leftward progressive movement, and in each case, there's a significant failure. So the conservative strategy is to go back to the 1950s, right? It's to return to this time where you kind of had this idyllic American existence. And to be very clear, I'm not one of these people who like, oh, the 50s weren't that great. No, they were way better than what we have now. But still, it's a failure to understand the nature of the problem. Because a lot of you'll hear a lot of people talk about having a constitutional convention or these kind of things. If we could just patch through some of these problems, get rid of the Commerce Clause in the Constitution, and make sure the Second Amendment's a little more clear, and that's really the issue. But that misses the point. The problem is not that we didn't get the contract law exactly right. The problem is the contract doesn't matter anymore. The contract is fundamentally broken because the people who wrote it and the people they wrote it with are gone. And we have not renewed it. We have not kept that chain of custody that we were entrusted with as a culture and a people. And that means that there are consequences. And we want to avoid the consequences. We just want to go back to the system we think that we like. But we are not there anymore. And more importantly, like we said, society has fundamentally changed with the managerial structure. And so we have to acknowledge the fact that, as you said, we are no longer those virtuous people that Adams referenced in his famous quote. We are no longer those people. And that doesn't mean that we should not be looking to a future where we can once again reach those heights. But we have to acknowledge where we are now. And we have to acknowledge that we have to be governed now. And that means that we might have to change things. We might have to look at things from a position of people who are, as we talked about with a libertarian problem, moving towards virtue rather than assuming that we are virtuous and therefore can order our society towards liberty. The problem with with kind of the anti-woke liberals is even worse because they just want to go back to the 1990s. They still completely buy into the system. And to be fair, so do the conservatives in many ways. They still largely believe that there's nothing wrong with kind of these scaled bureaucracies. But the anti-woke liberals are even worse because they really just want to roll liberalism back to the last patch. They're saying, oh, well, everything about basically like Bill Clinton or Barack Obama was fine, but then things got off the rails. It's like, no, there are core assumptions about the way we order our society that are really an issue. And if you're not willing to go back and dig those out and figure out a way forward that takes those things into account, then you will just replay this. And we've seen these, as a conservative who has tried this many times, we know this game. We've played it many times. Oh, Ronald Reagan will just, bring us back, or, George Bush, or maybe even Donald Trump will bring us back. Those retrenchments never last. The progressives always come back, pull those roots back up, and further the revolution way beyond what it was when these conservative figures come in and kind of dial things down for a few years. And so we have to understand that ultimately there is a problem with the system. And if we don't change the system, if we don't address those systemic problems, then just going in and trying to roll things back a little bit, tweak things back just a few decades is not going to be the solution.
Yeah, what I found myself doing was like going because I wasn't into political theory and this kind of stuff prior to 2020, at least that much. I would listen to people, but I'd be like, maybe Reagan, maybe he was a great guy. And then you look at Reagan and, there's some virtue, there's some good stuff. And then you keep going back, you're like, maybe Nixon. Okay, well, when were we virtuous? And I kept going back, and that's why I ended up going like pre-enlightenment. I'm like, we gotta go way back to like how people are formed. And that's why I end up wanting to study theological anthropology, because I think a lot of this stuff has to do with the fundamental nature of man. And Christians have a lot to offer on this topic. We just have to relearn it and remember it a little bit. One thing that I wanted to ask, because so far we've talked a lot about theory and kind of conceiving things as the way they are, which is great. And I could talk about that all day. One of the questions that my more pragmatic, and I don't mean that derisively, I just mean they just want to know what to do. What do I do? So the question I want to ask you, Auron, is how do we win? How do we win? What's the game plan? Are there multiple plays, or what's kind of a way forward for us?
So I discussed in the book a couple different theories that are out there of kind of how we can move past this moment, not just the conservative and anti-woke liberal, but a few things that people have actually suggested that go outside the box. I think that ultimately, like we said, we're in a moment of shifting epochs. Really, we're looking at a system that has been dominant for liberal democracy, and kind of the scaled managerial bureaucracy that followed has been dominant for hundreds of years, and it's had a strong run. It's relatively brief on the historic stage, but you got to give it credit. It basically conquered the world, right? And so I'm not. It's easy for us, like you said with Reagan, right? We can look at Reagan, we can say, oh well, he really messed up the amnesty thing, and he really messed up the gun control thing, and what a bad president. But at the same time, we weren't fighting the Soviet Union, and nobody was, we didn't have thermonuclear war, hanging over our heads. So we have to put people in their context, right? And so we have to understand that ultimately, they have to be judged in that time. And so I don't want to give us this idea that there's that all of the things that have been tried previously were just failure, or these people were bad people. That's not the case at all. But ultimately, I think that we are at the end of an epoch. We are seeing the end of a particular way of social organization. It's reaching its limits. We're beyond modernity. We're even beyond postmodernity. Most people, postmodernity. It's got the postmodern Marxists are coming for us. No, the postmodern Marxists are old news. Like, they're dead. They're dying. Like, they're facing the same problems that the moderns faced when the postmoderns started making critiques of them. And so I think we're moving out of anything we know right now to something new. And that's a scary time for sure, but it's also an exciting time, because that means that there are opportunities that exist outside that just we wouldn't have had previously. So I don't think ultimately that humanity can continue to operate at the scale that it's on right now. I don't think it's healthy for the reasons we talked about previously with managerial structures. I think those things have to end. And again, scary, because so much of our society is based on the idea that you can call someone in, across the world on a moment's notice. We just take that as a given, and we think that's like critical to our existence of humans. But actually, humans were just fine without that, and you'll be fine too. And so I think ultimately what has to happen is our communities and our worlds have to become much smaller. We have to go back to a way of being that is communal. That is one where we are bound in a order that allows us to share our rights and responsibilities and duties with others, share our lives with each other, and ultimately build those more organic bonds that truly fill us as humans and make us what we are. And so I think we're probably in a scenario where I don't know. Of course, it's all, you're staring into a crystal ball and trying to make predictions, and it'll always make you look stupid, right? Because no one can truly see the future. But I think ultimately the solutions come much more locally. And I don't just mean the like, clean up your room, though that's really good advice too. Like that's good individual advice. Jordan Peterson's right about that. But it's clean up your community, clean up your church, clean up your family, clean up the world around you. Now that doesn't fix everything, to be really clear. Like ultimately large scale changes, nationwide changes, you need to care about that stuff. I'm not saying, don't care about federal stuff. Don't ever think about that. That stuff's going to matter to some extent. But ultimately what's really going to matter, what's going to create the virtuous society that has the leaders that you're looking for, who can actually make bigger changes, they have to exist first. And that ultimately means us scaling things down, caring about each other, and being willing to make sacrifices, right? Like we are to the point where if tomorrow the federal welfare state fell apart, could your church take care of your community? That's huge, right? And we can't ask for the end of the total state, or we can't hope for the end of the total state until we're willing to take those responsibilities back, right? The state's not going to house my parents when they get old. Am I willing to do it? The state's not going to take care of my brother if he's addicted to drugs. Am I going to be accountable now? Like these are responsibilities and things that we became comfortable with pushing off to someone else. But if we're going to counteract these things, if we're going to create these societies of, close-knit virtue and organic bonds, we first need to be able to accept those responsibilities. And that's really the hardest thing of all, because that's the one thing we've been trained we don't need to do.
Yeah, and it's a great Christian encouragement as well, because we are called to do that. I mean, it's going to take sacrifice, both financially, time. You're going to have to make choices that are not always the most convenient when you help other people, when you do things that don't really have a great ROI, at the end of the day. And you're going to have to trust the Lord with the results of that by following his word. So I think that's a great place to end. Auron, thank you so much for coming on the show. Where can people follow you and pick up the book?
Oh, absolutely. No, thanks for having me. Of course, my show's on Blaze TV. I've got the podcast, Auron MacIntyre Show. You can get it on any podcast platform or YouTube. And then the book is available, of course, on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, all of those major retailers have it. It comes out Tuesday, May 7th.
Ah, perfect. All right. Well, I'll put a link to that in the show notes so listeners can go pick it up. Thanks for joining me today, Auron.
Thanks again.